Πολύ λίγα λόγια για τα πάρα πολλά που θα οφείλω να πω για τον James Whitley, ο οποίος είναι καθηγητής εδώ και πολλά χρόνια, το 1990, της Μεσογειακής Αρχαιολογίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Cardiff στην Ουαλία, όπου διδάσκει και ερευνά. Υπήρξε ένας πολύ επιτυχημένος διευθυντής της Βρετανικής Σχολής στην Αθήνα, ανάμεσα στο 2002 και το 2007, συνεχίζοντας τις έρευνες της Βρετανικής Σχολής και στην Κνωσό, αλλά και στην υπόλοιπη Ελλάδα, όπου αυτές διαδραματίζονται, και έχοντας κατά νου να βοηθήσει τα νέα μέλη, τη νέα γενιά, να φτάσουν στην Αθήνα και να δικτυωθούν επιστημονικά μιλώντας μέσα στο γίγνεσθε της ελληνικής αρχαιολογίας. Έχει κάνει πάρα πολλές δημοσιεύσεις. Τόσες πολλές που δεν προλαβαίνουμε να τις διαβάσουμε. Θα πω τις δύο κυριότερες, που ουσιαστικά είναι βιβλία αναφοράς για όλους μας και θα είναι, πιστεύω, για όλη την επόμενη τουλάχιστον 15 ετία για μας και για τους φοιτητές μας. Πρόκειται για την Archaeology of Ancient Greece, το οποίο βιβλίο έχει πάρει και ένα πολύ μεγάλο βραβείο του Ράσιμαν για το 2002, και βέβαια αυτή την δημοσίευση το 2023 της Κνωσός, Myth, History and Archaeology, για το οποίο σας είμαστε ευγνώμονες. Εδώ, σε αυτό το βιβλίο, θα μου επιτρέψετε, κύριε Whitley, να πω ότι αυτό που σας κάνει τόσο ιδιαίτερο και τόσο σημαντικό στα αρχαιολογικά γράμματα είναι ακριβώς τα γράμματα. Δηλαδή, είναι ακριβώς το γεγονός ότι έχοντας μεγάλη και βαθιά γνώση της αρχαίας ελληνικής γραμματείας, έχοντας βιώσει την ελληνική γλώσσα, την αρχαία ελληνική γλώσσα στην καλύτερη εκφορά της, μέσα από τα κείμενα, μπορείτε να συνδυάζετε, παρότι μελετάτε εξίσου και την προϊστορική αρχαιολογία και την ιστορία του Αιγαίου της εποχής του Χαλκού, μπορείτε να το βλέπετε αυτό μέσα από τη ματιά του αρχαιολόγου, του ιστορικού, αλλά και του ερευνητή της φιλολογίας. Και αυτό, όσο με αφορά, αλλά πιστεύω και πολλούς άλλους, κάνει την ιδιαιτερότητά σας και τη μοναδικότητά σας. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ και παρακαλώ να έρθετε στο βήμα.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Χρυσουλάκη. Είναι μεγάλη τιμή και χαρά να είμαι εδώ, να μιλήσω για τον Πραισό, η πόλη του Ετεο-Κρητών. Και, ναι, όπως ξέρετε, τα υπόλοιπα είναι στα αγγλικά. And my talk is called The Polis as Ethnos, Preisos, the Polis as Ethnos. The study of archaic Greek history exhibits a long-standing obsession with the polis. There are sound reasons for this. The polis, as a political community, is central to our understanding of archaic Greek culture, the fluorescence of that culture, and the competitiveness of that culture and virtually everything else about it. Crete is unusually well supplied with these polis. Different passages in the Odyssey and the Iliad talk of Crete of the 90 cities or the 100 cities, hence the ΕΚΑΤΟΜΠΟΛΙΣ, the title of this series, the exhibition of this series of talks. Paula Perlman, let's move on. Sorry, back. That's the polis. Come back to that particular slide. Paula Perlman counts 49 in total that flourished in archaic and classical times in Crete. Praissos is unusual in that while it is clearly a polis, it is not obviously a Greek polis. It is a political community that conforms to Greek political norms without thinking of itself as Greek. Or so we infer from the ancient sources, which identify Praissos as the city of the Eteo-Cretans, etymologically the true Cretans, one of the 5 peoples of Crete mentioned in the Odyssey. Herodotus recalls a Praesian story told to him that the Praesii were the Polychniti, the remnants of the original Cretans when King Minos led his disastrous expedition to Sicily. Strabo equates the Praesians with the Eteo-Cretans. Antiquarians, such as Pashley and Spratt, and archaeologists, such as Federico Halbert, Bosanquet, and Arthur Evans, and epigraphers Comparetti, Conway, and others in the 19th and early 20th centuries were able first to locate Praissos, as Strabo's count is vague and ambiguous, that's too far, and to investigate part of it. So this slide shows the famous Monitoplu inscription, which Pashley studied, and that settled a long-standing dispute about whether Praissos and Priansos were the same city. So from this inscription he inferred that Praissos must be located in eastern Crete. These investigations produced a number of inscriptions which are written in a version of the Greek alphabet, but which are clearly not in the ancient Greek language. The inference that here was the city of the Eteo-Cretans, the true Cretans, was obvious and has determined the path of scholarship ever since. One path taken by scholarship was to take investigators very far from archaic Crete. Evans, Bosanquet, and other British scholars took Homer and Herodotus in endorsing the idea that the Eteo-Cretans were aboriginal survivors of a Greek invasion, or rather of 2 successive Greek invasions, first of Achaeans and then of Dorians, who survived in the fastnesses of the eastern extremity of the island. As Bosanquet put it, the Satia Peninsula is a Cretan Wales, and like Wales, it has its Pembrokeshire. Now this particular phrase, this analogy, will probably be unintelligible to most of the audience here. And it refers to events in British history which were well known maybe in the early years of the 20th century, but are less well known now. The Pembrokeshire in question here is the peninsula on which the city of Etenos now sits. That's what Bosanquet meant by Pembrokeshire. He meant Etenos and the Etenos Peninsula. Just as the original Pembrokeshire in Wales was settled by a mix of Norman, French, Flemings, and Englishmen in the 11th century AD, who then went on to invade Ireland, that's another story, so central Crete and the Etenos Peninsula were settled by Greek speakers from outside the island. This is what Bosanquet was referring to. Praissos remained the stronghold of the original inhabitants, just as the Welsh are the Eteo-Britons, who had maintained their language and identity in the face of successive Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman invasions, so the Eteo-Cretans are the aboriginal remnants of the subjects of King Minos, the Minoans. For the early excavators of Praissos failed to find what they were really looking for, clear stratigraphic evidence for continuity of occupation and culture from the Bronze Age through into the Iron Age and into archaic times. That is, material evidence that the Eteo-Cretans were indeed the successors of the Bronze Age original inhabitants, soon to be widely referred to as the Minoans. Archaeological endeavours in Crete from 1910 onwards focused primarily and sometimes exclusively on the remains of this lost race of the Bronze Age. This began to change in the 1980s, primarily with excavations at Lefthana, renewed excavations and investigations at Prinias, Gortin, Axos, Driros, Anavlachos, Etenos, Azuria, Praissos, and now Liktos have redressed this balance. The archaic period is no longer neglected. Though Halbert and Bosanquet only stayed for one season at Praissos, they did establish the general topography of the city. Praissos sits on 3 hills or acropolis. Acropolis A, or first acropolis, is the principal one, with the second acropolis, Acropolis B, to the north. So these are 2 views. This is the view of Acropolis A from the southwest, and this is a view from the north of Acropolis B and Acropolis A behind it. So the 2 out of the 3 acropolis. And the third one, this is a view of the altar hill here. Sorry. And this is the first acropolis behind it, again from the southwest. The principal sanctuary of ancient Praissos stood on this hill, the altar hill, or third acropolis, though there was no temple. It was, in Bosanquet's terms, a hypaethral sanctuary, an altar bounded by a parapet. It was on or in this parapet that the laws and later the treaties of the city were originally set up. So we go back to these things in this museum in the next room. You can see them. They're from Praissos, and they come from Bosanquet's and Halbert's excavations. These early researchers also established that the main cemetery of Praissos lay to the south, the cemetery ridge, and that the lower slopes of the first acropolis and the whole of the second was covered with rock cuttings, apparently parts of houses. To the south of the cemetery area, they managed to locate 2 further sanctuaries, the spring at Whitley, on the road to the village now called Nea Praissos, and the spring at Mesambresis. So these are some of these springs. This is the spring at Whitley here. This is the spring at Mesambresis. And this is another site I'm going to be talking about, Prophetus Elias, on the top, the highest point in our survey area. The focus of Bosanquet's excavations, however, was on the altar hill and on the lower slopes of the first acropolis, where he uncovered a large classical building he interpreted as an andreon. And I'm sorry, Bobby Cole, but I will be talking about the andreon. Not all excavation in this period could be described as scientific. The terracottas from the shrine at Whitley were looted in 1896. Examples have found their way into many museums around the world: the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Louvre, the Museum for Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg, the British Museum, the Mitsotakis Collection, the Goulandris Museum of Cycladic Art, the Ηρακλείου Museum, and the Cittia Museum later on. And it's not quite true to say that. So here are some of these terracottas from Praissos in the Metropolitan Museum. And it is not quite true to say that the more serious excavation in and around Praissos had ceased by 1910. Members of the Greek Archaeological Service, including Mavroides in the 1930s, Nicholas Platon in the 1940s and 1950s, Metaxia Titopoulou in the 1980s, and Chrysias Sofianou more recently, have investigated both the site and its environs. And this is the cover of Metaxia's book on East Cretan geometric pottery, or East Cretan geometric and orientalizing pottery. From 1992, I led a British, or rather British, Irish, Greek, Dutch team which produced a new plan of the site, then undertook several seasons of field walking in 1993, 1994 and 1998. One of the facts we established was that the city was not very large, no more than 28 hectares at its maximum extent, and that many of the rock cuttings on the first and second acropolis must be remains of classical and Hellenistic houses. Though small by Cretan standards, Praissos seems to have been dead. Next, the Armentry House or Andreon, of which more later. For I think we have to think about that is, scholars and scientists, are interested in Praissos. Those who live in and around the villages of Nea Praissos, Whitley and Aispiridon will of course have their own reasons for being interested in their ancient site. But to which general questions about archaic Greece is Praissos good to think with? And here I want to look at the terms polis and ethnos afresh. So start with the polis. Once upon a time we knew what a polis was. It was a kind of state, one that relied primarily on the principle of citizenship and had a central urban core. Polis were citizen states, and they rose in the years after 700 BC. In this respect, they were unlike the kingdoms to be found to the east and south of the Aegean, the unashamed monarchies of the Near East and Egypt, in that they were republics, where power was shared. The polis was born in the Archaic period, flourished in the classical times, and fell in the Hellenistic period after the defeat of Thebes and Athens in the Battle of Chaeronea. Needless to say, this vision of the polis does not work well for Crete. Most Cretan polis were unaffected by the rise of Hellenistic kingdoms, Etanos excepted, and most work done on the polis has concentrated on Athens, the political community we know most about, but also probably a very untypical example of a polis. Participation was through citizenship, and citizenship was reaffirmed through participation in cult. In Josina Bloch's memorable phrase, polis were covenants between gods, she put forward in her 2017 book. In English, and even more so for historical reasons in Scots English, the word covenant evokes a very different kind of political community to one that is we think of when we think of Greek political communities. Indeed, it evokes a political community that has often been seen as the polar opposite of everything Greek. The ancient Hebrews, whose principal cult involving animal sacrifice took place on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Josina Bloch fully intends this analogy, of which more later. If, however, a polis is a citizen state and its basis was more religious than secular, enacted and reaffirmed through participation in cult, then what is a citizen? Both men and women participated in cult in ancient Athens, but traditionally, that is, in traditional scholarship, women were not considered to be citizens. Scholars generally followed Aristotle, defining someone a citizen as who's defined by his participation in decision-making and rule. Bloch argues, however, the role of women in cult means that they were citizens too, their role being complementary to that of men. That an inscription with the word asti, meaning citizen woman, that has been discovered at Axos, suggests that this might apply to Crete too. But how, you may ask, can we be sure that Praissos was a citizen state, albeit one in a Cretan sense? How can we understand its institutions if we can't read the archaic inscriptions written in Eteo-Creten? Well, for one thing, it looks very much like other Cretan polis. It has laws and sanctuaries, and later, in late classical Hellenistic times, there is epigraphic evidence that it had the kind of magistrates that we would normally associate with a Cretan city. In two related 3rd century inscriptions, there is mention of a protokosmos, the first cosmos, who shares power with his synkosmi, fellow cosmi or fellow regulators. This is exactly what we would expect from any other Cretan city. The other change in perspective on the polis has come from John Marr at Columbia University in New York, who just published this book. This book really does change the debate in several ways. For one thing, he thinks that the heyday of the polis dates very late, from 350 to 250 BC, that while different types of polis were making fruitful developments in the Archaic period, the dominance of Athens and Sparta from the middle of the 5th into the middle of the 4th century BC, he calls it the 100 Years' War. Again, that evokes another war between England and France in the 14th and 15th centuries, hindered rather than fostered that development. He emphasizes both the adaptability and resilience of the polis, which only came to end in late antiquity. In a similar vein, I've argued in a recent article that Praissos itself exemplifies this resilience. A community of citizens was difficult to destroy precisely because if any of the citizens survive, then the political community can be reformed around certain cults. To bring such communities to an end, you have to destroy both their cults and their constituent units, the household represented in Crete, in its material form by the pithos. Another source of anxiety and debate is whether the polis can be considered a state. Ancient historians have generally assumed that it must fall into this category. though at least one ancient historian disagrees. More seriously, the polis appears not to satisfy the cross-cultural criteria established by American cultural anthropologists for a political community to be considered a state. Polis lacks sufficient social and settlement hierarchy, and in general are just too small. The 49 Cretan polis are really very, very small in comparative terms. Smaller than those of other Mediterranean islands, and far smaller in area than the minimal size suggested by anthropological archaeologists from Ann Arbor. To quote Norman Yoffe's rule, if you can question whether a political community is a state, then it isn't a state. And the Michigan inference would be polis are not states, but chiefdoms. Well, I think that's absurd. One of the reasons why polis in general, and Cretan polis in particular, are good to think with is that they clearly disprove this whole Michigan approach to what is a state. But let's turn to the question of the ethnos. The ethnos is often thought of as the opposite of the polis. An ethnos is a regional confederacy of smaller political communities, some of which call themselves polis. Examples include Achaea, Aetolia, Phocis, and Thessaly. Like the polis, the ethnos had a sanctuary at its core, so the Aetolian one had a sanctuary at Thermon. And like the polis, the ethnos was a community of cult. In the conventional account of Greek history, the ethnos flourished in the early Hellenistic period to 146 BC, when the Aetolian and Achaean leagues put up a determined resistance to Rome. I'm not, however, going to use ethnos in this sense. Despite comprising a number of subordinate polis, such as the Stallite and the mysterious Dragmos, Praissos was never a confederacy in this sense. It was, however, clearly a political community with a strong sense of ethnic difference, as the story that Herodotus claims was told to him by the Praesians clearly attests, namely that it was only the Praesians and Polychnete who remained after King Minos' disastrous expedition to Sicily. Such a tale fits in with Jonathan Hall's definition of ethnicity. The people of Praissos possessed a myth of shared descent, a charter myth which established their claim to the lands of eastern Crete. Strabo then links this myth to Homer's Eteo-Cretans and links Praissos in turn to the sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus, of which more later. But this political community continued to make use of the Eteo-Cretan language in a public sphere may also be relevant. At least two of the inscriptions found by Halbert, Comporiti, and Bosanquet were public inscriptions written in Eteo-Cretan and set up in the sanctuary in the altar hill. That Eteo-Cretan required a slightly different set of graphemes, that is, letters, to accommodate the idiosyncrasies of their language, indicated by a preference for this particular letter form, here, which was discussed a long time ago by Lillian Jeffrey. Both the language and the material fact of the inscription themselves may then be indicators of Eteo-Cretan identity, or at least Praesian identity. Yet there is a problem here. Eteo-Cretan inscriptions are not confined to Praissos itself, nor to its territory. Long ago, Henri van Effontaire identified at least one Eteo-Cretan inscription from Dreros. This characterization has been accepted by Yves Duhon. More recently, a number of inscriptions have turned up at Isauria, notably one on the room of Epithos, which can be plausibly interpreted as Eteo-Cretan. It certainly doesn't make sense as Greek. In none of these cases, Eteo-Cretan is the sole language inscribed. Eteo-Cretan inscriptions appear alongside Greek inscriptions at Dreros, Isauria, and indeed, in later times, Praissos itself. This raises the question of whether the distribution of Eteo-Cretan inscriptions is in any indication of the extent of Eteo-Cretan speech. Eteo-Cretan is a spoken language. It may not be. To return to my Welsh analogy, in Wales, Welsh is used for inscriptions in my home university of Cardiff, where everything is officially bilingual. And while Welsh speakers are easy to find in my university, they are outnumbered by English speakers, if not by the speakers of the 100 or so languages that you can hear on the streets of Cardiff, Greek included. Even as early as 500 BC, and certainly by 400 BC, then Eteo-Cretan may have simply become an official language. A language of law and religious ritual are not of everyday speech. This does not mean that the language, Eteo-Cretan language, did not play an important role in Praesian identity. It clearly did. This brings me to that other vector of identity, cult. But it is in cult that the two dimensions of identity in politics, Preisos as polis, a covenant state between gods and men, and Preisos as ethnos, a community united by a myth of shared descent, overlap. So back to Strabo, who located the sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus somewhere near Preisos, and who in turn linked Preisos with the Eteo-Cretans. Strabo's words have determined in large part the agenda of much topographical, historical and archaeological research in eastern Crete. When he said that where Preisos of the Eteo-Cretans existed, there too was the sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus. And Dictae too was near, not as Aratus says, close to Mount Ida, for Dictae is 1,000 stays from Ida. And this is the passage that confused early antiquarians. But where is this Hieron of Dictaean Zeus? Captain Spratt had investigated the hill of Prophetess Elias above Preisos, where ancient remains were visible. Halbert and Bosanquet initially looked hopefully at the sanctuary on the Altar Hill, or Third Acropolis, close to where Aegean inscriptions have been found. There they found an open-air sanctuary altar, votive offerings of a strong association with warriors, but no dedicatory inscriptions to Zeus as such. Bosanquet was eventually to locate this sanctuary, that's to say the sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus, at Palekostro, presumably built over the remains of the Bronze Age town. His investigations yielded a rich assemblage of bronze votives, including tympano very similar to those who have been found in the Idaean cave, another sanctuary of Zeus, together with a famous inscription of Roman date, the hymn to Dictaean Zeus, which identified the sanctuary. What then was the relationship between the sanctuary and the city, both the settlement and the political community of Preisos itself? It would be tempting here to invoke the Depolliniac analogy and argue that just as the establishment of the Argive Horion on the opposite side of the Argive plain from Argos defined the territory of the emergent polis of Argos around 700 BC, so the establishment of the sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus at Palekostro helped to define the territory of Preisos against the neighbouring city of Isanos. Territorial aggrandizement on the face of the Cretan Pembrokeshire, represented by the city of Isanos, inhabited by Greeks, not Eteo-Cretans. There are certain facts which would support this interpretation. One is the similarity of metal finds between the sanctuaries of the Altar Hill, near Preisos, and at Palekostro. Another is that in the 6th century BC, the terracotta frieze built for the temple at Palekostro could only have been produced by a political community whose craftsmen were as skilled in choroplasty as those of Preisos. A third is the observation by Halbert and Bosanquet that the sacrificial debris from the Altar Hill contained those of rams and oxen, animals appropriate for the worship of Zeus. I have in the past argued something along these lines. There are other sanctuaries that may have functioned as border shrines between Preisos and Isanos. One is the spring at Atnixi, near Rusa Ecclesia. So that's there. Another a deposit of votives over the Bronze Age structure at Stukuku-Tokefali, near Zakro. The Annexia has been thoroughly studied and published by Bryce Erickson, who was first excavated on Minikos Papadakis. Both the topography of the shrine, a spring shrine, and the iconography of the votive plaques found there are remarkably similar to those recovered from the shrine at Babili, just south of Preisos. This sanctuary then has strong claims to be a border sanctuary. But this is all partly a function of the unusual richness of the choroplasty, the largely terracottas from Preisos itself. About 1/3 of the geometric, daedalic and archaic terracottas from Crete found in many museums across the world come from the Preisos region, while certain themes, a woman with a high polos, the Astarte figurines, are found elsewhere. There's a new concentration around Anablikos. Certainly very distinctive types stand out. These include this type, the man with the staff, found at Preisos itself, and these border sanctuaries. and a sequence of warrior plaques. The man with the staff is one type that clearly goes through a series. That is, where the original moulds can no longer be used, the terracotta plaque was used to make a new mould. The end result is a series of successively smaller and fuzzier plaques, a fact already established by Halbert, and which you can see in the sequence of plaques of this type in Praissos. But these types are found at Vaveli, Anixi, and the small shrine over at Tsukukutokefali, near Apano Zakro, shows to me that they're being used to stake out the territory of Praissos in relation to Etanos. Or to put it in ethnic terms, the true Cretans of the Cretan Wales are defining themselves through cult and their material culture against the Pembrokeshire of Etanos. The man with the staff then shows one aspect of the iconographic conservatism of Praissos. This conservatism is also in evidence in the imagery to be found on other plaques, most notably the warrior plaques, which show a high degree of iconographic continuity from the geometric period through the Archaic and into the early Classical. The earliest geometric plaques show a warrior with elaborate crests and a shield. The next type, apparently of Archaic date, show the same type of warrior but with the addition of a ram on the shield. And the final Classical type shows a similar warrior, but now with the shield itself is in the form of a ram's head, rather similar to the Leonidas sculpture from Sparta. This last example is rather significant for me because it was unknown in Tuller excavations of 2007, which took place just by underneath the structure Bosanquet called the Andreon on the first Acropolis. We initially classified it as a pithos fragment, and it comes from the area of Bosanquet's dump. It was only revealed to be a terracotta plaque when I cleaned it in our study season of 2008. And that's the area of the so-called Andreon. Other finds from the dump included numerous fragments of plain neck cups, probably of early Classical date, and numerous animal bones. These finds led us to think that Bosanquet may have been right in his identification of the building as an Andreon. So we'll come to the Andreon. Apologies to Bobby Cole. The Andreon is a Cretan institution well evidenced from our literary sources, which are generally much later than 500 BC. So those are the cups from which we excavated, and this is the literary and epigraphic evidence for the Andreon. The literary sources are supported by epigraphic evidence of Archaic date from Crete, most spectacularly from the Spensidios Mitra, which mentions the Datalis. As Mika Prentice pointed out, the references are to an institution and are not necessarily to a type of building. We do not find a form of architecture equivalent to, say, a Prytaneon in Crete. And there is a tendency for archaeologists to identify any large structure they find in a Cretan city of Archaic to Hellenistic date as an Andreon. There is now general agreement that many reasonably large buildings in Crete of Archaic to Hellenistic date were multifunctional, and this includes many structures identified as temples, such as the Hearth Temple at Driros. The search for an architectural Andreon is, in my view, a vain one. But it is possible to define the Andreon in behavioural or material terms. One of the other notable patterns in the archaeology of Archaic Crete is the discovery of large deposits of paying cups, neck cups for the most part. Examples have been found near Istron. The type site is probably the Shrine of Glykos at Knossos. One of these cup deposits have been found within our survey area at Site 14 on the summit of Prophetus Elias, the most exposed site within our survey, and a place which Spratt considered to be a possible location for the sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus. Sorry, that's a view of Driros. So here, this is the site of Prophetus Elias, and these are the cup bases we found here, which Bryce Erickson dates to the Archaic period. So there's no Archaic gap in Praissos. Another feature at Driros or wild. Dora Levy at Axos noted a number of extinct species such as gazelle found in one of the excavations there, and Marinatus noted horns of the Cretan agrimi in his excavation of the temple there. More recently, a re-examination, so there we are, there's Driros. More recently, a re-examination of one of the other structures, Ius Antonius at Driros, has revealed diev in the report. That is to say, hair, lagos. Hair and agrimi have also turned up at Azuria, though the contexts are not clear. Why this emphasis on wild or feral species? When Richard Madrick, this is Richard Madrick, my colleague at Cardiff here, standing in front of me, examined the animal bones from our 2007 excavations, that's say from Bosanquet's dump, he was struck by the large number of hair bones. We also had some larger than average goat bones, which I would like to interpret as agrimi, but that's not certain. Hairs turn up quite frequently in archaic Greek iconography as love gifts, as here on a vase by the Amasis painter and as on this plaque from Katosimi. Here too, Angelikis Lebesi's discussion, based on a passage of Ephorus Strabo, is very helpful. Wild feral animals seem to be exchanged between older and younger men in a homoerotic bonding ritual. Oops, there we are. My argument then is that the consumption of wild and feral animals, animals that could be hunted and so required a display of masculine prowess, is linked to the creation of younger citizens through this ritual. Part of this process took place in settings, but not buildings we might like to call Andrea, but these would include places outdoors like Site 14, and at Praisos at least two, one by the later Andreon, classical date excavated by Bosanquet, which appears to overlie earlier structures, and one at Site 14 at the most exposed site in our survey. Creating citizens here also involved the deposition of votive plaques, perhaps the warrior plaques, in certain sanctuary sites. So just to sum up, Praisos was then in some respects a recognisably Cretan polis. It was built, like Elefthana, on several tongues of land in the rugged interior of the island. It was densely settled but not particularly large. Hence, perhaps Strabo's use of the term polychnion. It probably was a citizen state where the participation in cult was used to define membership of the political community. Unlike other Cretan polis of archaic date, the Andreon was a central institution used to initiate younger men and so create new generations of citizens. As a political community, it flourished from the 8th to the 2nd century BC. Its destruction between 145 and 140 BC was part of a pattern of the ending of political communities that accelerated during the 2nd century BC. Its identity as a distinct ethnic and political community was maintained partly through its use of the Eteo-Cretan language and partly through the distinctiveness and conservatism of its material culture, expressed through its choroplasty, long-day terracottas. The manner of its destruction between 145 and 140 BC, forced abandonment of households. So here's the floor level with an abandoned pithos, and the final disposal of the feminine symbol of the household, the pithos, and the destruction of the city's principal cults and laws. So the laws were found on the west side of the third Acropolis here, approximately there by Bosanquet and Halbert. Tells us something about the institutions that lent this community its resilience. For these reasons, I'm happy to call Praisos, or rather the Praesi, not simply a political community, but a state, and not merely a polis, but an ethnos. It needs then to be drawn in more closely to wider debates, not only about the polis, see John Marr, but also about ethnic identity in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean. This then might be its significance for scholars of the ancient world. But what about Cretans, and Cretans who live close to Praisos in particular? If the inhabitants of Praisos were the true Cretans, and their culture and language has been lost, what is their relevance to modern Cretans, who also see themselves as Greeks? This partly relates to that unanswerable but often posed the descendants of earlier Bronze Age inhabitants of the island, what language that lies within the boundaries of the former Kinotita of Praissos, which comprised the villages of Nea Praissos and Iospiridion. There is a local antiquarian society led by Nikos Kokinakis. Members of this society feel their site has been unjustly neglected for some time. I've also heard suggestions that the current Demos Sitias should be renamed as the Demos Praesou when these changes to local government go through again. All this is to say that modern and ancient identities are always intertwined. The past exists in the present and the present in the past. So this was just the coda to my talk, and these are the people who have supported excavation and study around Praissos since it began in 1992. And normally I would just thank everybody concerned, including my institution, Cardiff University. But alas, we're not living in normal times. There's a coda to this talk. My career at Cardiff will shortly be coming to an end. I've worked there for 34 years as part of a school of history, archaeology and religion. As an archaeologist, I've worked closely with colleagues in ancient history, and this talk is the product in part of this rapprochement and close relationship between classics and archaeology. I could not have made any real contribution to scholarship without this. All of this is now under threat. The new Vice-Chancellor of Cardiff University, Wendy Lana, is proposing to bring to an end degrees in nursing, music in Wales, modern languages, religion, theology, and ancient history. I do not think that archaeology at Cardiff can survive without ancient history. In any case, these proposals represent an unprecedented assault on the humanities and are part of a wider and worrying trend in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. I believe that talking about the West in these general terms, as politicians want to do, without reference to our shared heritage, is vacuous talk. Civilizations have roots, and if those roots are not cared for, if they are not watered, the tree of civilization dies. This is what I fear most. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, καθηγητά Whitley, για αυτή την υπέροχη παρουσίαση της Πραισού, που μοιραστήκατε μαζί μας τις βαθιές γνώσεις και τις σκέψεις σας για αυτή την υπέροχη πόλη. Έχουμε χρόνο για μία ή δύο ερωτήσεις, αν υπάρχουν, το κοινό. Σε αυτή την περίπτωση και πάλι ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την τιμή που μας κάνατε. Ναι, συγγνώμη, Αργύρο. Yeah.
I would ask about the animal assemblage. You probably have the answer to that. What is the length of occupation in the cave? Do we have human remains too? Oh, sorry. Okay. Wow. Okay. It'll be very interesting to radiocarbon date those bones or selectively date some of those, just to see. Yeah. Yeah. Not high precision, yeah, you're right. But really very interesting. Also, that would show in the diet of the people too. I mean, this huge introduction of wild species in the diet that would show on their... Oh, just the... Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Αν δεν υπάρχει άλλη ερώτηση, καθηγητά Whitley, ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που κάνατε την τιμή να είστε μαζί μας. Ευχαριστούμε και εσάς που ήρθατε και όλους που μας παρακολουθείτε διαδικτυακά και ανυπομονούμε για την επόμενη διάλεξη. Καλό σας απόγευμα.